What did you speak about here at the AFA World War III conference?
Well, it's very interesting. I was coming here to talk about how Marxism uses scientific concepts that are not really scientific, and I was going to brief that. It really is going to go to the fact that it's a dialectical type of attack that you can trace through Hegel to Plato, and I was going to put the architecture together to show how they use science today to make that happen. A couple days ago, I was talking to Karen, and I told her, "Look, I'm looking at all this stuff from a warning side of view, and do you have enough security? Because it looks like a lot of stuff is going to be happening, that things are already moving." And she said, "Could you please? I know you really worked on this brief, but could you please, instead, could you make a brief under the warning? So what's happening?" So what I did was I really basically took the slides that established how the dialectical attacks were, and some other things to lead people along, so that when I finally got to the talk about the attack and how it will look, there was a way to see that it's happening. For example, that when there's a dialectical attack, most people don't understand there's a three-pronged attack, but they don't understand they're even being attacked. So if they're getting attacked from over here, they don't really quite realize that attack from over there might be the same. And the example I used in terms of warning, the warning was, the window's opening for 2020 type attacks where they're signaling. And I introduced this concept I used peaceful protest as the example. When the average person heard government leaders say peaceful protest, they said, "This is crazy." But our argument is those government leaders, when they said peaceful protest, were talking to the initiated, the people who knew what they meant, and saying, we're going to let you do what you do because we called what you're doing peaceful, and we're going to stop people who don't. And of course, when you went through what happened in 2020, it was very clear. I don't know if they'll use the word peaceful protest this time, but I showed that in 2020, before the Floyd event in Minneapolis, I had already written a paper saying we're going to see violence this summer. It's going to start around Memorial Day weekend, and it will start in Minnesota. And I said, here's the signal. And it was a picture of Ellison holding up a book on Antifa, supporting Antifa. And lo and behold, we had these shootings of three Christian students, children, little kids, and three adults. And how is it possible in a situation where a trans radical goes and shoots these kids up that the whole story is about the Second Amendment? And that the people who are at risk are trans people who might shoot somebody. That's like a replay on the War on Terror, where every time there was a terrorist attack in the United States against Jews or Christians or something like that, our national element would respond and say, well, we have to make sure there's no attacks on Muslims. It's like, whoa, wait a second here. The attack everything happened the other way. So what I did was I showed that here you have the lieutenant governor of Minnesota wearing a shirt that says something about trans youth, protect trans youth, with a knife on it. Like a bayonet tape knife. And I said, this is again a government leader actually signaling that we will tolerate we will allow trans attacks on people, and we will consider that a protected thing. Now, I could end up being wrong. This was kind of an indicator of a warning, right? But then we see the vice president make some statements, and then we see some trans violence that it's just allowed to happen. So what I did there, that was the first excuse of seeing violence. We had a Marxist mayor get elected in Chicago, and all of a sudden, boom, like it went right back to 2020, violence in the streets. We saw it in Akron, Ohio. We've seen it in some other places. So things are cycling up, and I think that we should look to Memorial Day weekend for the same type of escalation. It may be from some multiple vectors. I really wanted to build that up to introduce a concept called the Christian nationalism movement. And from the Christian side of the equation, you have Marxists who are dedicated to attacking them, really putting attack on them. But we've kind of had a recognition that for the last couple of years, the Islamic movement concluded in some manner that the most powerful pro-Israel bloc in America are conservative Christians. And so we see on the media these kind of left-wing attacks on conservative Christians. What we're not seeing is the Islamic movement, whether it's Al-Isa from Saudi Arabia, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood domestically, and the people who are orchestrating this Christian national attack are working with them. And our hypothesis is, as these conservative Christians are attacked, the narrative will start to turn to an anti-Semitic dislike of Israel. And all of a sudden, ping over here, someone releases a video of Netanyahu from 20 years ago saying, we control America. Someone asked, is that an accurate translation? I said, I had two people translate it. I got two different answers, but what matters is the English subtitle said that. Mm-hmm. And then you see this happen, you see that happen, you see the same people doing the Christian nationalism narrative from the left, showing a picture of a clearly Christian dressed like priest of some sort, and say, we have to protect Palestinians from Jewish oppression in Israel. So what's happening is you're seeing this narrative here internationally converging with other narratives here. So we see windows are opening of opportunity. Mm-hmm. And pointing to the conference here on China, what I pointed out was that China brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia to put their issues aside. Mm-hmm. Well, that's an unnatural event that won't sustain itself. So what you have is, you have a window is opening on things where things can happen domestically, where all of a sudden, conservative Christians and Jews are fighting for each other because people are fighting each other, because there's narratives that are created to generate friction, and there's distraction. You have this trans and BLM stuff going, and all of a sudden, someone makes a move on Israel. And everybody here is distracted, or all of a sudden something happens with Taiwan. So the really force of the briefing was to try to point out to people, could this not happen at all? It could not happen. It might not happen, but there's enough out there to say, look, these things don't happen by mistake. And a key point I made when I showed how dialectical attacks work is, you think this thing up here, you think this thing over here, and you think this thing down here are all from different things. They're all on the same dialectical attack narrative, a mass line narrative, and they're designed to converge on a point. Could I end up being wrong? Yes. But at this point, there's enough there to raise warning and to start watching for it, because it could happen. And of course, in 2020, I wrote the paper saying it's going to start in Minnesota, and here's why, and it did. Mm-hmm. And it did for exactly the reasons we stated. And they're using this open communication where politicians are, having these trans violence T-shirts that are clearly a tolerance of the counter-state in the state. That's a political warfare term. Being willing to condone that. So that's, in a nutshell, that was what the discussion was about.
Mm-hmm. So when you refer to an attack on Israel and will be divided, yes. The attack would presumably come from Iran or through Hezbollah in Lebanon, right?
Well, I think we're in a period of things that a completely conventional attack is something that you can't rule out. But I think things are in an irregular war kind of fashion, and destabilization. What kind of war? Irregular, like watching for destabilization on a level that people kind of expect destabilization activities to cap off at a certain area. And my concern is things may be, people expect it to level off at a certain area, and it might not level off at a certain area. And if you recognize the Marxist nature of these things, if you go to the extreme, that if they see an opening to bring pulling the tent down, that's entirely possible. That's a concern.
The focus on trans rights and abortion, but particularly on tribalism, the mainstream population and not racism, but a bias against trans people or LGBTQ people. Why the emphasis on that right now?
Well, I think it's important to know that there's a fundamental distinction between someone who may be gay and someone who's LGBT, because LGBT is an intersectional line of operation in Marxism. So when you see that there's LGBT attacks, it's completely designed to be pitted against a cultural value. So, for example, it's very easy to see that, conservative Christians are against that type of lifestyle, and they're going to ram it right down their throat. Does that make sense? And so it's not for the purpose of having any toleration, it's for the purpose of destroying a value. And that's how intersectionality works. So if you could put the attacks and the narratives in this intersectionality is a scientific sounding word that was created by Marxists that really covers for the fact that it's an attack. It's a mechanism to have an attack. So there's, like, let's just say 12 intersectional lines of attack. Critical race theory is run by BLM. Gender is kind of the LGBT community, and now they're focusing on trans. Does that make sense? And you can, ageism is coming up, and there's I think they have 15 on the thing. So that's how I would answer that.
On what sort of thing?
On intersectional line, Marxist attacks are based on intersectional attacks. Now, what happens is if you take and stack together all the intersectional attacks, if each one of them succeeds, you basically you've accomplished. The term is cancel culture. You've negated the culture because it's a dialectical attack. Well, cancel culture is just a trendy way of saying destroy the culture, and of course in German that's aufheben der Kultur. That's the motto for the Frankfurt School that a man named Lukács branded in the 1920s. So when you have completely canceled the culture, then the people are woke. That's where the term woke comes from, and you can literally pull it out of Mao's Little Red Book. So this language it's not kind of sort of following a Marxist trend. This is Marxism pure. It's a pure Marxist attack. And what you see is the Islamic movement in America looks like they're going to help out. We know that some groups in the Muslim Brotherhood in 2020 actually ran the ground game for some of these Antifa events, like Linda Sarsour, I think, in Nashville, or somewhere in Tennessee, or I think. Right. So we can expect to see this again, or we should be watching for it. I don't know what we expect to see, and this could all blow over. But we're seeing the things. The order of battle is are lining up, and we don't want to be caught shocked at the day before.
So we use the term a kinetic war to describe what our concept of war. But is China and, shall we say, communism already in a hidden war, a stealth war against the U.S. and the West?
Well, I mean, the Chinese have come out and said they're basically in a state of war right now. But I would like to point out that the Chinese concept of political warfare, from unrestricted warfare, and Sun Tzu going into the back, would suggest that they're willing to engage in this political warfare until we just get worn out. And that while they hold out the ability to fight a war, they may well attack Taiwan. Mm-hmm. But maybe they're achieving their goals just by, writing things out and keeping things at a high level of tension, because I think that they might believe, for cause, that they can win a war against America without firing a shot.
By controlling our pharmaceuticals, our economy?
By having effective control of elements of power that they do control pharmacy. How did that happen? Okay, but that they seem to have the upper hand on a lot of issues, and in fact you have a lot of domestic Marxists who seem to be in line with that. Go back to it, 1972, I think the iconic Marxist of modern America is a man named Marcuse, and he basically said in 1972, we're joining the Long March, and we will start it in campuses, and we will do counter-state operations. First take over the campus, then when you're on the campus, take over the faculty, and the faculty will see who gets the masters and PhDs, and 50 years later, all of a sudden, everybody at the top of industry, there's people who came out of that vetting process, and we wonder why, gosh, why is the CEO of Budweiser doing this? And it's like, are you really asking that question? And so I think a paper I wrote on Marxism in 2019 was remembering the misremembered left, because people think they understand what Marxism is in the left and they have no concept. So I used the phrase remember because you've forgotten, and then misremember because what you think you know is wrong. Because we're seeing classical Marxism all over the Frankfurt School unroll right now. Slow subversion over time.
You talk about misremembering or re-remembering. Google buries, if not hides, entirely certain facts that people know that they lived through. And then they look for references to it, and they've been, as I say, buried and can't be referenced if you wanted to show someone or build an argument or just a look at history. Is that a Marxist technique?
Well, okay, I will say this. Now you're making me kind of roll my eyes to think if I come up with this man's name. He's second generation Frankfurt School, and it's right on the tip of my mind. But he created something called discourse theory. And discourse theory is about the systematic censoring of opposing voices. And if you take, we'll bring up Marcuse again. In 1965, he wrote a book called Repressive Tolerance. And in Repressive Tolerance, he was basically saying that in order to have tolerance in society, you have to be selectively repressive against conservatives. While they build the phrase is while they build a subversive majority. Well, of course, in 1965, that meant they were a subversive minority. And it had to do with the systematic suppression of non-conforming voices, because to a Marxist, anybody who disagrees with them is a reactionary or a conservative. So you put that along right next to this concept of discourse theory, and it basically gives them the ability to turn the microphone off. Or at Google, turn off if the metaphors turn the light off or turn the microphone off. Yes, they've engaged in that, and that's a form of Marxism called semantic Marxism. And they have been engaged in it.
Is YouTube doing that, and Facebook, when they're squelching points of view on, let's say, a public health policy?
Well, they did squelch people on public health policy, and we know that. And I think the severe issue was they said they would yield to WHO guidelines. But the man who ran WHO is a Marxist. And it's also an international organization that has no jurisdiction inside the United States. So when you saw that happen, he was a Ethiopian man, I think he still is, and a Marxist. In fact, there are people who want him for war crimes for things he did in Ethiopia and was part of the People's Republic there. So I do think we have that issue of that happening. It's not, do I think it happens? It happened as a matter of fact. And, I was working with some doctors who were elite epidemiologists, and just to watch their papers disappear from peer-reviewed journals like Elsevier Science, after writing documents that could challenge the paradigm, but met peer review, met repeatability processes. So, yes.
So in view of this, are there solutions? Because it seems like the elected officials and the government-appointed officials seem to be doing things that are not in the public general interest.
I think a lot of times we talk about the fact that the goal is to disenfranchise the population. And how many times do you, as someone who would, like, for example, I don't belong to a party, vote for a Republican and you don't get what you want, and you don't seem to close the loop that you've been disenfranchised. You're voting for people who are not going to do it. A slide I didn't show in the brief because we ran out of time was the loudest thing that happened in 2020 wasn't the loud riots, it was the dogs that didn't bark. The dogs that didn't bark were Republicans who were supposed to stand up to this, and yet they were systematically and directionally silent, as if half the equation in a Marxist mass line movement was that the opposition would be silent, and they were. So people were left completely unprotected.
Are you saying on January 6th or after the imprisonments?
I'm sorry, I said January 6th. I meant during the COVID lockdowns. I meant that, sorry. But let's go to the January 6th. There is nothing happening on January 6th. These people have been imprisoned unlawfully, and everybody knows it, and they want you to know that. So why are they still in jail? Why are they still in jail in a way that somewhat violates the American concept of justice? And where are the Republicans saying, I don't want to have a discussion about what happens, this is wrong. It's wrong that it's happening, it's un-American.
Have we already been veiled into reality denial through the National Guard placement throughout D.C. in the first 3-4 months of the Democrat administration?
I don't know about being veiled. I just can't speak to that. I'm not sure I understand your question.
I mean brainwashed in that sense, or was it during the lockdowns where people's social and professional status was at risk if they didn't conform, and so people seem to have forgotten that, and the persecution of business and the economy.
Well, I think that that did happen. There is a reality dislocation. People have been turned upside down. All the science that already existed, all the peer-reviewed science now is coming out and saying those masks did not work. You can't make this. You can't even make the theoretical argument. And yet, where I live in Maryland, I could watch people walking by themselves on a sunny day by themselves, outside with masks on. And I look at that, and there's a part of me say, these are the people who will believe what they think are the authorities say, no matter what. And that's where you get to this quote by Pieper, Joseph Pieper, that is echoed by a man named Bezmenov, that we're at a point where we could tell you the truth, we could take you to a concentration camp or a gulag in Russia, and you still wouldn't believe us. So yes, I think we're in that zone, and I think things are happening because they've assessed that we are in that zone.
And with the mainstream press, especially when someone says, well, if that's not the case, then why don't I see it on ABC, CBS, or NBC? How are people supposed to break this deception or a guise over us?
Well, I won't say ABC News because I'll put it in a different context. I think that when you watch the 24-hour news cycle, you think you're informed, but all you are doing is agreeing to your own ideological patterning, so that it's not lost on me that Fox News is the dialectical opposite of MSNBC, and they're almost a dialectical event. It's not natural that most of the population is that far left, or that part of the population is where Fox says they are. But if you ever notice, for conservatives, if they watch Fox News and someone where they're light talking head says, they're really saying, if you disagree with what we said is the conservative view, well, you're crazy. And what they're saying is you stay inside the bubble. So I guess my take on it would be, every narrative converts to a narrative mean by these stations. They exist, the far left, the far right, to keep you in this thing where the goal is not to resolve the issue. I think people should stop watching it. I think people should stop watching it almost completely, because you're not getting what you need to know. And I think you could get a lot of forums where you could identify someone who spends all their time watching MSNBC at a social event, or Fox. And the two things that can happen is, one, they don't realize that everybody's got them pegged because they're just talking heads for what they saw. And two, they don't realize everybody else realized that you really don't know what's going on. You were watching program that took an event and over the narrative course of what was happening, converted to a standard position. I don't know if that makes sense.
But one doesn't need to watch television to be brainwashed through the online gatekeeping of news reporting, right?
Social media does that as well. So all of a sudden they find what you like and they just bombard you with that, and you don't realize that you're getting the view you wanted, not necessarily the view that is true. So I think that if you want to cascade that question out further, I think people need to be selective in terms of how much social media they get, and how much social media they get, and how much weight they put in on it.
Well, you could stay away from, if you say social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and still when you log on using Microsoft Bing browser, the MSN.com news that they select is also through what they show and what they won't show, editorially also shaping people's view of reality.
I understand that the stuff I do is not the fix I like to think it is, but I've dumped my Microsoft browser. I've dumped Google search. I took DuckDuckGo or something. I look for different search engines because, it at least gives you ability to do something, to get a different slant on things. But, your point is that you're being fed what you are to know. And, I think it's the passive knowledge. You might be working and all you're seeing is headline comes up and you don't even realize you're being formed a certain way. And the people, you might say that's just what's happening in the world. So no, someone selected how you're, not just what you're going to know, but how you're going to know it. And I think it would be true that this has always happened, but I think today it's so intense, it's so pervasive, because social media, people live by their social media now, and so I think that there's a risk of these people become prisoners of the social media world, so I think it's a problem.
You think the name social media came in to, it was perhaps, as you say, pushed upon us to acclimate the notion of socialism being acceptable?
I don't know about that. I've never thought about it, so I don't really have an answer. Possibly, but
Or the term community, they say the black community, to acclimate us to the idea of communism being beneficial to communities?
I don't. Anything's possible. But I never thought about it that way. I would be skeptical. Do you have? I mean, the idea that socialism can play on the words society and social is clearly there, but I don't know. I would say I haven't thought about it. It doesn't really generate that's interesting response.
But the notion of turning the population against each other, young and old, male and female, religions you think may be next?
Well, they're happening right now. That's the Christian national movement. They're targeting patriotic Christians for being patriotic Christians, and they're going to, what you'll see over time is it's going to fold into the January 6th narrative that they're basically racists, and this kind of Christianity is abhorrent, and in fact, true Christians would never be like that. So you'll see a transition to KKK stuff and stuff like that. So that's already going on, and then you have on the other line of attack the trans people attacking Christians.
Now, this concept of nationalism has been kind of distorted into a deprecatory negative. What is nationalism, and how can it be good?
Well, I think that we fall prey to the fact that they use the word nationalism, that they're successfully able to define in negative terms. So you are a people are allowed to have their identity, and the people are allowed to have their identity and express themselves. Marxism, and in fact Islam, does not recognize national boundaries. They do not recognize national identity, and therefore they're attacking it. But so they want to characterize a normally patriotic, normally faithful person. I mean, we can all picture someone who's a little off, a little overzealous, or a little over militant in what they believe. But and certainly there are people like that. But what they want to do is create a situation where they're going to critique all Christians as kind of being a little bit off balance and stuff like that. And the idea is, you'll say, if you're some regular guy who's evangelical, I don't want to be like that. I got to rethink what I'm going to do. And that's what they want. That's what what they want. Remember, Alinsky said they want to find the things that people have an issue with and rub their issues raw, meaning we are not here to solve the problem. We're here to get you so angry you want to get in a fight.
We meaning?
The Marxist attack narrative. But
when Obama and Hillary used to laud and praise Alinsky, why?
Well, I'm not going to. They praised him. They must agree with him. I think Alinsky was a Gramsci Marxist. Of course, people say he said he wasn't a communist. Well, they were able to say that because all they had to do was not have a card. We had testimony in the HUAC that how could you avoid saying you're a communist? Well, you're a member of the party, won't give you a card because you're not a card-carrying member. I'm going too far, but his language, Alinsky's method of operation is classical Marxism along the political warfare line of operation that we would now call the Maoist insurgency model. So.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Was that good?
Very good. 28 minutes.
Oh my gosh, I got to get back in. Did they